In January of 2000, Apple hosted another one of their Macworld Expos out in San Francisco, California. It was an annual event that allowed for them to provide the public information on the current state of the company, as well as their plans to enhance the Macintosh platform. But this year, things were going to be quite different. After about an hour of showing off performance reports and incremental updates to existing Apple software, the company's now permanent CEO, Steve Jobs, simply said, "But we're not done yet." Just 10 minutes later, the crowd was looking at something that, as Jobs put it, would set Apple up for the next 20 years. It was called macOS 10. Although the name was simply derived from the fact that it was the 10th edition of macOS, it couldn't have been more different from its predecessors. It introduced a whole new slick and three-dimensional design unmatched by the mainstream systems of the time, functionalities that emphasized convenience and ease of use, and a completely new architecture built from the ground up that would truly take the Macintosh and personal computing as a whole into the new millennium. Despite its demonstrably smaller market share compared to something like Microsoft Windows, it would prove to be very influential in setting the standard for how a digital environment should exist. But of course, achieving this remarkable feat was not an overnight success. For one, its commercial release wasn't until 2001, and the success of macOS 10 involved many growing pains and obstacles for the Macintosh, and even Apple as a whole. Both its conception and execution were strategic, methodical, and took advantage of the rapid technological advancement of the time. This allowed for Apple to create a system that gave users what they wanted and gave them things they didn't even know they wanted. It is these things that allowed for macOS 10 to change the world.
Well, we could certainly learn a thing or two about a thing or two. My viewers always ask me, "Cameron, you're the Casanova of San Francisco. How do I get a girl?" Well, just tell her how groovy she is. Chicks dig that, man. You know what they also dig? Is glasses. Warby Parker glasses, to be specific. Here I have the Chemi-Wide and Licorice Crystal with the anti-reflective and scratch-resistant coating, so that I can not only get a good glimpse at those who worship me, but now I can also see all the success and potential that the universe has laid out for me. And thanks to Warby Parker's love for their customers, you can go into any Warby Parker store and get your glasses personally stylized with the help of friendly advisors, just like I did. With Warby Parker, I just feel whole again, man. The ladies just can't get enough of it. I don't know if it's them reminiscing of their adolescence, rocking out to Buddy Holly, but it's freaking transcendental, man. You can get your own Warby Parker glasses today by visiting the QR code on the screen or the link down below. Pairs start at $95 plus free shipping and free 30-day returns, and even gives you the option to use vision insurance. And every purchase you make gives someone in need their own pair of eyeglasses through Warby Parker's Buy a Pair, Give a Pair program. Now that's out of sight if you ask me. See what I did there? Stay cool, Warby Parker.
Now, this is going to be the first episode of a new series. Much like my Microsoft Windows series, this series is going to be on the history of macOS 10, with each episode covering a new version and all the remarkable changes and innovations that they made. For this first video, we of course will be talking about macOS 10 Cheetah, the one that started it all. Now that probably goes without saying. However, there had already been a version of macOS 10 from 1999 called macOS 10 Server. But don't be fooled. Although their names are similar, they had different purposes, served different audiences, and had entirely different frameworks. Yes, while this was technically the 10th edition of macOS, it was still visually very similar to all the versions that came before it. All the major innovation was under the hood, and even then, it did not hold a candle to what we would then see in 2001. You see, one of the main reasons for why Apple was struggling so badly back in the 90s was because of its lack of vision for the Macintosh. They could no longer ride the wave of the Apple II, as command line personal computers were on their way out. Ironically, the reason for this was the release of the Macintosh in 1984, the first commercial PC to use a graphical user interface. You know, where you can click and drag things on a screen. It was a trendsetter, but also very expensive, so it didn't garner the sales they expected. And over time, they were being killed off by the very trend they helped popularize. And so, they were effectively just rehashing tiny updates of the same almost 2-decade-old code. Yes, they made some changes to the kernel over the years and even added support for PowerPC, but Mac OS was just a decrepit, weak operating system. And by the end of the 90s, it was really showing its age. At least Microsoft's Windows 9X kernel had the advantage of being supported by a variety of platforms and programs, which made its market share way larger. Apple didn't even have that. Something had to change. In another twist of irony, they turned to the man who left Apple just the decade prior, Steve Jobs. His company, Next, was showing a lot of promise in the industrial computer software business, thanks to their breakthrough operating system called NextStep. It was built on top of the Unix kernel, a Mach and BSD hybrid to be specific. Now, why did this matter? Because Unix was incredibly advanced. I've already talked about Unix in detail on my video about Linux, but the long and short is that it was designed, from the very beginning, to work on very powerful machines. It did this by allowing multiple users to use the same hardware simultaneously through software multitasking. It also simplified file systems using an organized hierarchy system, and also treated everything as a file, meaning things like peripherals and drivers could be programmed and implemented in the same way. It was also designed to work on a ton of different computers, regardless of the kinds of hardware they contained, meaning you could easily move an environment from one machine to another. This was just a few of the things that made Unix so special, and its code kept being built on and improved with this philosophy over the next several years. But because Unix was built for very powerful and expensive machines, it obviously didn't take off in the PC market, which focused on portability and affordability. MS-DOS had this exact same flexibility, but with IBM PC clones, which were popping up everywhere in the 80s and 90s. Yes, MS-DOS was weaker and simpler, but it was built for weaker and simpler machines, which is all everyday consumers needed at this time. Mac OS, however, was not designed for IBM PC clones. It was only designed for Apple machines, and in fact, installing the system on anything other than an Apple machine without their permission was a terms of use violation. These circumstances allowed for MS-DOS to pick up in popularity very quickly, and therefore support way more programs. This only amplified once Microsoft built their MS-DOS-based operating environment, and eventually system, Windows. But then computers started getting cheaper and more powerful at a rapid rate. This meant that running something like Unix on a portable consumer-style PC was becoming more of a possibility. That's when Apple saw the potential of an incredible system like NextStep and decided they wanted to purchase it as a last resort before Apple reached possible bankruptcy. The disadvantage that NextStep had was that it came too late. Not only was it 4 times the price of Windows 95, it didn't have the influence and popularity that Microsoft had on PCs, and therefore didn't have the same kind of software support. Those issues then became recursive. Even though Apple was struggling, they were still in a close third place in having all PC market share, just barely behind IBM. So they had the potential to at least be a much more powerful second place. They just needed to repeat the level of innovation they had with the first Macintosh. Next had the software, and Apple had the clout. And so helping each other out would be mutual. In 1996, Apple acquired the NextStep software and hired Steve Jobs back on as the interim CEO of Apple. But before they could do anything with NextStep, they first had to get more eyeballs on the Macintosh itself, with other innovations that were much simpler and faster to put together. In 1998, they released the iMac, which was not only a vibrant and colorful counterstatement to the ugly beige boxes of the time, but it turned the complicated process of connecting to dial-up internet into just a couple of clicks. You could take your beautiful new iMac out of the box and be on the internet in less than 10 minutes. It was not only the success Apple needed to get back on track, it quickly became the #1 selling computer in America. This now gave Apple plenty of time to start experimenting with this next step Unix technology. They started taking baby steps with it first, and just a couple of months before the release of the iMac, they came out with Rhapsody OS. This is essentially the system that you're seeing when you use macOS 10 Server 1.0. Yes, while it is running this Mach BSD hybrid, which would eventually be called Darwin in 2000, it still has that classic macOS design to it. Additionally, Rhapsody was definitely an improvement over the archaic macOS, but it still had its problems. Being that it was an entirely new system under the hood, a lot of third-party software developers were reluctant on moving their programs over to it, even though Apple had already added support for their own technologies, like QuickTime and AppleScript. The most notable company was Adobe, who did not want to create entirely new APIs and essentially rewrite their code for a system that no one had any idea was even going to perform well, especially a system that, at the time, was only being marketed to businesses and server owners. Rhapsody's Blue Box feature allowed for old Mac apps to run on the system, but without any of the new features. It was basically like just running a virtual machine of the old Mac OS on a new system. In other words, you were running these old programs without the preemptive multitasking or faster startup speeds. You know, the things that made Rhapsody a worthy upgrade in the first place? What was the point of upgrading if you only got those features on new Rhapsody-based programs and not the classic Mac applications that dedicated users had grown to love? Apple had to rethink how they were going to integrate this next step technology. They released Rhapsody's macOS 10 Server 1.0 in 1999 as a temporary improvement while they figured this issue out. And that is when we get to the true home consumer version of macOS 10. And it couldn't have come at a better time. In 2000, the idea of running an advanced system like Unix on a cheap and portable personal computer was finally a commercially viable concept. Apple just needed to make its integration much more gradual. Instead of only relying on this blue box feature, the new macOS 10 introduced something called Carbon. So instead of just running the old apps in a virtual machine, Carbon effectively helped developers take their old code and easily make it readable on this new system, so that it could run directly on it without any emulation. So now, only a small amount of changes had to be made to the program, rather than completely rewriting it. This allowed for a huge chunk of old Mac applications to run on this environment while also getting access to the advantages of a Unix system. So now that old copy of Photoshop was gonna boot up much quicker with these Carbon implementations than it would if it just ran in Blue Box. But of course, not all legacy macOS programs got the same level of love and support from their developers. So that meant that there were plenty that were not optimized for the Carbon API at all. So in that case, how do you run these applications on macOS 10? Well, Apple didn't get rid of the blue box feature entirely. Instead, they transformed it into something called Classic Environment. This was basically the last resort. If you had an old program that just did not work with or receive support with the Carbon API in any way, you could still run it under the traditional virtual machine setup. You can even see how much it looks like the old macOS. Blue Box was now the backup solution, instead of the only solution, like it was under Rhapsody. You got the best of both worlds, as a great philosopher once said. Anyway, it was the rapid advancing of hardware at this time that made this approach feasible. For hardcore, experienced computer nerds who knew what they were doing, macOS 10 was a huge deal just based on these features alone. But in order for Apple to really get their software to have the kind of success they had with the iMac, they needed to find a way to appeal to everyone. What is one way you can immediately grab the attention of someone who knows nothing about computers? By changing its design. by turning it into something that looked cooler and easier to use. On top of this beautifully crafted and well-supported bridge from the old to the new, macOS X would get a complete overhaul in its design that still bared enough resemblance to its original look. It was an overhaul that not only didn't require a learning curve, but it arguably made macOS even easier to navigate. They called it Aqua, as it literally looked like little droplets of water on the screen. Thanks to this stable Unix structure and Y2K-era PC hardware, Apple was able to run this beautiful, glossy interface quite comfortably, with some nuance, which we will get into later. But it ran just well enough at the time for it to be unlike anything people had really ever seen on an operating system before. With this Aqua design being updated to Apple's website at around the exact same time, it quickly became the iconic style for the company. As Jobs put it, it was a design that was so good, you kind of want to lick it. I will never get tired of that quote. So, 1 year after its announcement and several beta releases later, macOS X Cheetah was released to all Apple users, business and home, in March of 2001. This started a new trend of having every macOS update afterward still keep the macOS X name. It was a nice round number, but also it further exemplified Apple's vision to keep macOS X as the system that would take them into the next 20 years. And that is ultimately what happened, as macOS Big Sur would officially be released as macOS 11 in 2020. To distinguish between these versions, they started a trend of naming all of them after cats, which is how the first macOS got the name Cheetah. Funnily enough, no one is sure why or how the cat trend started, but some people have taken it on as a metaphor for something that is fast and powerful with a little bit of grace. The prominent features of Cheetah stand out right away, such as the Aqua interface, as well as a feature called the Dock. In addition to having icons on your desktop, you could also have your favorite programs at the bottom of the screen, where they were always visible and within easy reach at all times. You could add programs, remove them, and even move them around to be exactly the way you wanted. What also made this Aqua design feel more fluid was the little transition effects that complemented it, such as the little swoosh effect when you minimized a window, which Apple called the Genie effect. macOS X's redesign also made working with programs, many of which were from NextStep, a very easy and even fun experience. Not only did many of these programs also adopt this Aqua design, but they also became more straightforward to navigate. One NextStep program known as Preview became the default image viewer built into macOS X. You could easily make changes to things by just clicking and dragging stuff around. You also had a new program called iTunes, which had a very similar setup and became extremely popular following the release of the iPod. Then, of course, you had what was arguably one of Apple's most iconic software suites, iLife. You had programs like iMovie and iDVD that were actually very advanced and offered really good features as layman tools. iMovie had actually some pretty good effects on it, which only got better as the years went on, which was a big contrast to the much more primitive Windows Movie Maker. iDVD let you create your own Hollywood-style DVD menu, the ones that were very popular in the early 2000s, rather than just boringly burning data to a disk and doing nothing else. The stability of this Unix foundation also allowed for these advanced programs to run quite smoothly. And with time, the iLife suite would only continue to grow and become more fruitful. Pun intended. So, macOS X Cheetah actually proved to be way more stable and robust than even the home editions of Windows that existed at the time. In fact, many of these Windows versions were quickly entering hot water and becoming increasingly more unstable. Since they were still relying on the 9X kernel that was derived from MS-DOS, its age was quickly starting to show.
You'll notice that this scanner build... Whoa.
The reason Unix got away with improving on decades-old code was because it was built for powerful computers from the very beginning. MS-DOS was always built for incredibly weak and basic hardware, and it kind of stayed that way. This is a big reason why Windows Millennium Edition was such a disaster. The architecture was just old, and Mac OS X was a breath of fresh air in comparison. But Windows still had all the market share and software support, but if they wanted to keep it, they needed to act fast. And so, Microsoft basically did what Apple did in bridging the old and the new together. They created Windows XP, the very first home version of Windows that used the new, much more reliable NT kernel, which was initially only used for business versions of Windows. Windows XP also included a compatibility mode where you could once again run old 9X programs. Now, these were both things that also existed in Windows 2000, but that was marketed as a business version, and things got much more refined under XP. Windows XP also had a design that was heavily influenced by Mac OS X. In fact, you can even find Aqua prototypes as a little Easter egg inside the XP source code. This was one of the things that assured that Microsoft could keep their majority market share. But Mac OS X quickly reached second place. But of course, Cheetah was not immune to performance issues. It was great, but again, there were growing pains. Sometimes things would get really slow, especially if the hardware it was running on was on the weaker side. Not to mention that the graphics API that made Aqua possible, called Quartz, still needed a lot of improvement. It was effectively in a this is good enough phase under Cheetah. But computer hardware was gonna get better throughout the 2000s, and so was this API, which would eventually give us the ultimate experience that Apple had been envisioning ever since its start in 1976. The future has never looked so good. If you would like to learn more about Next Step, you can find my video on that right here, as well as related videos down below. A special thanks to my patrons. Check out patreon.com/nationsquid for ad-free videos and exclusive content. You can also watch me ad-free on Spotify if you have Spotify Premium. A coffee is always appreciated too. Thank you for watching, everyone.